For more than a century, the question has haunted archaeologists, historians, and anyone who has ever stood at the edge of a canyon and stared up at a stone village clinging to a cliff face. What happened to the people who built this? The Ancestral Puebloans, known to many as the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies or old people, thrived in the American Southwest for over 6 centuries. Then, in a span of just a few decades at the end of the 1200s, they were gone. Tens of thousands of people simply abandoned their magnificent stone cities, their cliff dwellings, their great houses with hundreds of rooms. They left behind pottery, tools, even entire rooms that seemed to have been sealed up as if the occupants planned to return, but they never did. For generations, the prevailing explanation was simple: drought drove them out. The Great Drought of the late 13th century had made life impossible in the Four Corners region, and the Anasazi had no choice but to leave. But now, after decades of painstaking research and groundbreaking new discoveries, archaeologists are uncovering the real story. And it is far more complex, more human, and more unsettling than anyone ever imagined. The mystery of the Anasazi disappearance is not solved. It is finally being understood. The story centers on the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, where the modern states of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet at a single point. This is a high desert landscape of sandstone canyons, pinyon juniper woodlands, and sprawling mesas cut by deep river gorges. The terrain is beautiful but unforgiving, arid, prone to extremes of temperature, and dependent on unreliable seasonal rains. It was here, in places like Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado and Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico, that the Ancestral Puebloans built their most spectacular settlements. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, with their intricate stone masonry tucked into natural alcoves high above the canyon floor, are among the most iconic archaeological sites in North America. Chaco Canyon's great houses, some rising 4 or 5 stories with more than 800 rooms, were connected by a network of straight roads stretching for miles across the desert. The location drew researchers because it held the keys to one of the great puzzles of North American archaeology. How could such an advanced culture simply disappear, and where did they go? Systematic archaeological research in the Four Corners region began in the late 19th century when ranchers and explorers stumbled upon the ruins and brought them to the attention of the scientific world. The Wetherill family, who ranched in the Mesa Verde area, guided early archaeologists to the sites they had discovered, including the magnificent Cliff Palace. By the early 1900s, institutions like the Smithsonian Institution and the School of American Research were sponsoring major excavations. The researchers expected to find evidence of a civilization that had collapsed abruptly, perhaps due to invasion or environmental catastrophe, leaving its cities abandoned in haste. What they found instead was more puzzling. The sites showed signs of systematic abandonment. Rooms were cleaned out, doors were sealed. The people had left in an orderly fashion, taking most of their belongings with them. This was not a sudden disaster. It was a deliberate departure. But why would an entire civilization choose to abandon homes they had built with such care and labor? The early excavations raised more questions than they answered.
For much of the 20th century, the dominant explanation for the Anasazi disappearance was the Great Drought. Tree ring studies by scientists at the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research had established that a prolonged dry spell gripped the Southwest from roughly 1276 to 1299, precisely the period when the Ancestral Puebloans abandoned their Four Corner settlements. The theory was simple and compelling. The drought made it impossible to grow enough corn, the dietary staple of the Ancestral Puebloans, and so they were forced to leave or starve. This explanation became textbook wisdom, taught to generations of students. But by the 1990s, researchers had begun to question the drought theory. Carla Van West, an archaeology graduate student, conducted a detailed study of the Mesa Verde region and calculated that even during the drought, there was enough potential agricultural productivity to support the population. The simple version of the drought theory just wouldn't hold up anymore. But if the Great Drought wasn't the sole cause, what was? Researchers began to explore a radical alternative, that the abandonment was driven by a complex interplay of climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval, and even warfare and religious crisis. One of the most significant breakthroughs in solving the mystery came not from human remains or artifacts, but from an unexpected source: the bones of domesticated turkeys. In a study published in PLOS 1 in 2017, a team of researchers led by molecular anthropologist Brian Kemp and anthropologist Scott Ortman analyzed mitochondrial DNA from hundreds of turkey bone samples collected from ancestral Puebloan sites. The researchers were unable to study human remains directly due to the reluctance of modern tribes to permit such analysis, so they turned to the next best thing, the animals that the ancestral Puebloans had domesticated and raised alongside them. The results were stunning. The genetic analysis revealed that before 1280, the turkey populations in the Mesa Verde region and the northern Rio Grande area of New Mexico were completely unrelated in the maternal line. But after 1280, the turkeys in the Rio Grande carried Mesa Verde haplogroups, clusters of inherited genes that indicated they were descended from the turkeys that had lived in the Four Corners region. The most likely explanation, the researchers argued, was that the ancestral Puebloans had migrated from Mesa Verde around 1280 and brought their turkeys with them, where their birds then interbred with local turkey populations. This finding provided strong evidence that the ancestral Puebloans had moved eastward to the northern Rio Grande region, where they became the ancestors of the modern Tewa Pueblo people. The study confirmed what the Tewa people themselves had always said: their ancestors had simply packed up and moved. The dating of the turkey bones and their associated archaeological contexts was critical to the study's conclusions. The genetic evidence showed a clear break around 1280 AD. Before that date, the turkey populations in the Rio Grande and Mesa Verde were distinct. Afterward, they merged, with Rio Grande turkeys carrying Mesa Verde haplotypes. This timeline matched the known chronology of the ancestral Puebloan abandonment. Tree ring studies, known as dendrochronology, had already established precise dates for the construction and abandonment of many sites. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, for example, was built over a period of decades, with construction peaking in the 1200s. The abandonment of the region was rapid, with the vast majority of settlements vacated between 1270 and 1290. The Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 provided the climate backdrop, but it was not the starting point. Abandonment had already begun before the worst of the drought set in. The turkey DNA evidence provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. It demonstrated not just that people left, but where they went. The dating of the genetic mixture, a sudden influx of Mesa Verde turkey lineages into the Rio Grande after 1280, gave researchers a timeline for the migration that aligned perfectly with what they knew from tree rings and archaeological evidence. Beyond the turkey DNA, the physical remains of the ancestral Puebloans themselves painted a grim picture of the conditions that drove them to leave. Archaeologists like Kristen Kuckman of the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center have spent years analyzing the refuse and human remains left behind at sites like Sand Canyon Pueblo in Colorado. The findings are chilling. At Sand Canyon, which was founded around 1250, the early refuse piles contained an astonishing 96% turkey bones, indicating that the inhabitants relied heavily on domesticated turkeys for meat. But in the final days of the Pueblo, the percentage of turkey bones plummeted to just 13%, replaced by wild game. This shift was evidence that the corn crops that had fed both the people and their turkeys had failed due to drought, forcing them to revert to hunting and gathering. The Pueblo was attacked sometime after 1277, and at least 34 people were killed. None of the bodies were formally buried, and at least 8 showed direct evidence of violent death, including signs of cannibalism. The analysis of human remains from the period shows widespread malnutrition, shorter lifespans, and increased infant mortality. The people who remained were starving, desperate, and vulnerable. The aggregate analysis tells a story of a society under extreme stress, its food systems collapsing, and its social fabric fraying to the breaking point.
What do these discoveries reveal about the daily lives and technology of the ancestral Puebloans? The ancestral Puebloans were primarily farmers, growing corn, beans, and squash in the arid climate of the Four Corners region. They were also skilled hunters of deer and rabbits, but their most important protein source was domesticated turkeys. As the population grew, reaching perhaps 19,000 people in the Mesa Verde region alone by the mid-1200s, the demands on the environment intensified. The people built elaborate check dams and reservoirs to control water and soil for crops, but these investments in the landscape also made them more territorial and less mobile. The technology of the ancestral Puebloans was sophisticated. They built multi-story stone villages with precise masonry, using timber imported from distances of up to 90 miles. Their pottery, especially the black-on-white ceramics of the Pueblo III era, reached new heights of artistry. They engaged in long-distance trade, importing turquoise, shell objects, and even macaws from Mexico. But this technological and cultural sophistication also created vulnerabilities. The population grew too large for the environment to support, and when climatic conditions worsened, the social and political systems that had held communities together began to break down. The ancestral Puebloans were not passive victims of climate change. They were active participants in their own transformation. As the system buckled, they chose to move. The people who left were not a beaten, broken remnant. They were survivors making a calculated decision to seek a better life elsewhere. The discovery that the ancestral Puebloans migrated to the northern Rio Grande region has profound implications for our understanding of the history of the American Southwest. For decades, the assumption was that the Anasazi culture had simply collapsed and disappeared. The new evidence shows that this is not true. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish, they transformed. They moved eastward, joining existing communities and over time becoming the Pueblo people who still live in New Mexico today. This conclusion fits perfectly with the oral histories of the modern Pueblo peoples who have always said that their ancestors came from the north. The Turkey DNA study provided the scientific confirmation that had long been lacking. But the story does not end there. Other researchers have argued that the ancestral Puebloans also moved to the Hopi Mesas in Arizona, the Zuni lands in western New Mexico, and other locations. The abandonment of the Four Corners region was part of a broader reorganization of Pueblo society, driven by the same forces of climate change, resource depletion, and social upheaval that had triggered earlier migrations in the 9th and 10th centuries. The implications are clear. The ancestral Puebloans were not a static culture, but a dynamic, resilient people who adapted to changing conditions by moving. Their history is one of booms and busts, of settlement and departure, of reinvention and survival. The story of the ancestral Puebloans is not a simple tale of a vanished civilization. It is a story of resilience, of a people who faced a perfect storm of climate change, resource depletion, and social conflict and chose the smartest option available, relocation. The Great Drought of the late 13th century was a factor, but it was not the sole cause. The ancestral Puebloans had weathered droughts before. This time they were dealing with a population at its peak, an environment degraded by centuries of farming, and a social system that was fraying under the pressure. They were also dealing with something else, the rise of new religious ideologies and the pull of new opportunities in the South. Some researchers have suggested that the Kachina religion, with its egalitarian spirit and promise of spiritual renewal, may have drawn people away from the old ways. The abandonment of the Four Corners region was not a collapse, it was a transformation. They left behind their magnificent stone cities, but they carried with them their culture, their traditions, and their turkeys. They settled in new lands, established new communities, and became the Pueblo peoples of today. The mystery is not fully solved. Archaeologists continue to debate the relative importance of climate, conflict, and ideology, but the new picture is far richer and more human than the old one. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish, they endured, they adapted, they survived. And their story, etched in stone and preserved in bone, serves as a powerful reminder of the challenges that all societies face when they push against the limits of their environment. As the American West grows drier and the lessons of the past become ever more urgent, the ancestral Puebloans speak to us across the centuries. They survived by moving. What will we do?